The roar of 20 Harley engines didn't just shake the windows of the old wooden house, it shook the entire neighborhood. Kaelen "Iron Eye" Vane was swinging his leg off his custom black cruiser when something stopped him mid-motion. It wasn't a rival gang or a police siren. It was a woman. Elora Vance stood on her porch, her white hair neatly tied back in a bun, her thin frame trembling in a plain black dress. As the biker gang surrounded her home, forming a circle of chrome and leather, she didn't run. Instead, she stepped down into the dust and knelt. In her weathered, wrinkled hands, she held out two things, a few crumpled bills and a tattered vintage photograph. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the idling engines. "They said if I didn't leave by sunset, they'd burn the memories with the house." Kaelen's men moved instantly, too aggressive, too fast, stepping toward the fragile woman. But Kaelen raised a tattooed arm, stopping them dead. People didn't offer the Iron Oaths pocket change. They offered them silence and paved the way in fear. He crouched down, eye level with her in the golden sunset light. "We're here for a debt, lady," he said, his voice like grinding gravel. Elora swallowed hard, pressing the photo into his palm. "I'm paying a different debt," she said, "because the law says I don't own my own dirt anymore." Kaelen looked at the photo, and for the first time in 15 years, the most feared man on the road froze. He noticed her bruised knuckles and the way she glanced at the blacked-out SUVs idling at the end of the block. He slowly took the money and the picture, not because he needed the cash, but because the secret in that photo was worth more than every life in his club. Stay with me until the end, because the command Kaelen gave his men next shocked the entire city and started a war no one saw coming. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you stand your ground if everything you loved was at stake? Now, let's get started. Kaelen "Iron Eye" Vane had been the president of the Iron Oaths for over a decade. He'd built the club's reputation on a singular, brutal foundation. The club comes first, and the debt always gets paid. Their territory ran from the industrial shipyards to the edge of the suburbs, and the rules were etched in oil and blood. You stayed out of their way, you didn't look them in the eye, and you never, ever made them come to your front door. That Tuesday evening had started like any other. Kaelen was finishing a collection from a local warehouse, the usual business that kept the club's engines purring and the local authorities looking the other way. His pack flanked him like a wall of human shields as they prepped for their final stop of the night, a long-standing debt at a small, worn-out house on the edge of town. The neighborhood knew the routine. When the Iron Oaths rode in formation, shopkeepers turned off their lights and families locked their deadbolts. They were the monsters in the dark. But as Kaelen looked down at the woman kneeling in the street, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the most dangerous thing in the neighborhood.
Kaelen "Iron Eye" Vane didn't lead the Iron Oaths because he was the loudest man in the room, but because he was the coldest. As he stood in the flickering fluorescent hum of a shipping warehouse on the edge of the docks, the air smelled of stale grease and unspoken threats. Two men, their faces bruised and their spirits broken, knelt before him, trembling as the shadow of Kaelen's heavy leather vest eclipsed the light. The vest wasn't just a garment, it was a ledger of every bridge he'd burned and every enemy he'd silenced to keep the East Side under his thumb. To the outside world, the Iron Oaths were a plague of chrome and noise, but to Kaelen, they were a machine that required absolute discipline to run smooth. He lived by a code that allowed no room for the soft rot of hesitation. "You broke the rules of the road," Kaelen said, his voice a low, rhythmic growl that carried more weight than a physical blow. "You skimmed from the collection meant for the widow's fund, and you thought the dark would hide you." The younger of the two men tried to speak, a desperate plea forming on his lips, but Kaelen silenced him with a single icy stare, the look that had earned him his name. In Kaelen's world, mercy was a luxury that led to weakness, and weakness was a death sentence. He built his reputation on the fact that his word was iron and his reach was long. Outside, the pack waited. 40 men on heavy cruisers, their engines purring like restless predators, formed a wall of denim and steel that kept the rest of the city at bay. They didn't move until Kaelen moved. They didn't breathe until he gave the word. He was their protector, but he was also their judge. Kaelen adjusted the heavy silver ring on his finger, the metal cold against his skin, and looked out at the sprawling territory that stretched from the docks to the downtown skyline. He had spent 15 years turning this neighborhood into a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the rules were clear and the consequences for breaking them were final. He believed he had seen every kind of greed and every brand of betrayal. He believed he was prepared for anything the night could throw at him. But as he signaled for his men to mount up and head toward the suburban outskirts for one last collection, he had no way of knowing that the weight of the vest was about to be tested by something far heavier than a traitor's debt. The road ahead was leading him to a small wooden house where a different kind of power was waiting to bring the iron oaths to their knees.
The golden hour light bled across the cracked asphalt as Kaelen held the tattered photograph, his gloved fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. Behind him, the low thrum of 20 idling engines created a wall of sound that usually felt like power, but in this moment it felt like a hollow echo. The image in his hand was black and white, silver halide bleeding at the edges from decades of humidity and touch, but the faces were unmistakable. It was a shot from 40 years ago, a younger, broader version of his own father, Silas Vane, standing in front of this very same porch, his arm thrown around a laughing young woman who held a newborn baby. That woman was Ilara, and the baby, Kaelen realized with a jolt that tightened his chest, was himself. The Iron Oaths hadn't started as a debt collection agency or a shadow government of the East Side. It had begun as a brotherhood of steel, meant to protect those the law had forgotten. Silas had founded the club after a factory strike turned bloody, recruiting men who were tired of seeing their neighbors bullied by those with deeper pockets. They were the gravel guardians, the silent sentinels of the suburbs who took no payment other than loyalty. Ilara's husband had been Silas's wingman, the brother who had taken a bullet meant for the club's founder, leaving Silas to swear an oath on the very dirt they now knelt upon, that as long as an iron oath wore the vest, the Vance family would never stand alone. Kaelen looked from the frozen memory in the photo to the living, breathing wreckage of that promise kneeling before him. Ilara's eyes were rimmed with red, her black dress dusty from the street, yet she held her head with a dignity that made his own polished chrome look cheap. He had spent years turning his father's legacy into a business of fear, forgetting that the iron in their name wasn't for the weapons they carried, but for the unbreakable nature of the promises they made. The realization was a silent explosion. The woman he had come to evict for a technical debt was the very reason his father had built the club in the first place. The iron-eye gaze that usually struck terror into men now softened as he saw the truth. He wasn't here to collect a debt. He was here because he was 40 years late on a payment of honor. As a black SUV from the Sterling Development Group lurked like a vulture at the end of the block, Kaelen felt the ghost of his father watching from the photograph, demanding to know if the man wearing the vest was still a guardian or just another bully with a bike. Kaelen's hand tightened on the photograph, the paper crinkling under his thumb. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the engines that had preceded it. He looked at Ilara, still kneeling in the dirt, her eyes searching his for a glimmer of the man his father had been. Slowly, deliberately, Kaelen moved. He didn't reach for his weapon or the money. Instead, he lowered his frame until his own knee hit the cracked pavement, coming eye to level with the woman his club had been sent to break. "Down," Kaelen commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer coldness of his tone cut through the evening air like a blade. Behind him, the ranks of the Iron Oaths shifted in a wave of leather and confusion. Jax, a younger member with fresh ink and a hunger for status, took a step forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "Boss, what are you doing? The contract says we clear the lot by tonight. The Sterling guys are waiting for the call." Kaelen didn't look back. His gaze remained locked on Ilara, acknowledging the history written in the lines of her face. "I said, every man kneels," he repeated, his voice dropping an octave into a warning. "Now!" A ripple of uncertainty moved through the gang. This went against every instinct they had been taught. Never show weakness, never bow to a mark, and always finish the job. They were outlaws, the apex predators of the East Side, and their leader was asking them to humiliate themselves in front of a suburban widow. To the younger members, it looked like Kaelen had finally snapped under the weight of the vest. But the older veterans, the men who remembered the smell of the old clubhouse and the sound of Silas Vane's voice, recognized the shift. One by one, starting with the gray-bearded lieutenants, they began to dismount. The heavy thud of boots hitting the ground followed, and then the rhythmic scrape of denim against asphalt as they followed their president's lead. Jax hesitated, his face flushing with a mix of anger and bewilderment. He looked at the black SUVs at the end of the block, then back at the sight of 20 hardened criminals bowing in a circle around a fragile woman in a black dress. The power dynamic of the neighborhood had inverted in a single heartbeat. "You're paying a debt of honor today, Jax," Kaelen said, finally glancing over his shoulder, his iron eye narrowed and lethal. "And if you can't understand why we're on our knees, then you don't deserve to wear that patch." In that moment, the Iron Oaths ceased to be a collection agency. They were a private army again, reclaimed by an old code that demanded they protect the very woman they had been sent to destroy. Ilara's tears finally spilled over, not from fear, but from the shock of seeing 20 monsters transform back into men. The sunset was casting long, jagged shadows of the motorcycles across the porch as Ilara began to speak. Her voice was thin, like parchment, but it didn't waver as she looked into Kaelen's iron-eye gaze. She explained that the trouble hadn't started with a missed payment, but with the dirt beneath her feet. The Sterling Development Group wanted the entire block for a high-rise complex, and her small, weathered home was the final piece of the puzzle. When she refused to sell the house where she had raised her children and buried her husband's memories, the negotiations had turned into a nightmare. It started with small things, fences cut, garden beds trampled, and late-night phone calls that went silent the moment she answered. Then it escalated. 2 weeks ago, men in expensive suits, accompanied by private security with dead eyes, had cornered her at the grocery store. They told her that an old woman living alone was a liability and that accidents happened to houses with old wiring. When she pointed to her bruised knuckles, she explained how one of them had gripped her arm so tight the bone nearly snapped while assisting her across the street. "I went to the precinct," Ilara whispered, her hands still clutching the photo as if it were a shield. "I told the sergeant what they said. I showed him the marks." She let out a hollow, bitter laugh that caught in her throat. "He didn't even look up from his desk. He told me that Mr. Sterling was a pillar of the community and that I was likely just confused in my old age. He said if I kept making trouble, they'd have to look into my mental competency." Kaelen felt a cold, familiar heat rising in his chest. He knew that sergeant. He was a man who took club money to look the other way on the docks. It was one thing for the law to ignore outlaws, but to ignore a widow whose husband had died for the city's peace was a betrayal of the highest order. The Sterling Group wasn't just buying land. They were buying the system to bully a woman who had no one left to call. "They're coming back tonight, aren't they?" Kaelen asked, his eyes drifting to the black SUVs at the end of the street. Ilara nodded, a single tear carving a path through the dust on her cheek. "They said sunset was the deadline. They said if I wasn't out, they'd clear the lot themselves." Kaelen stood up slowly, the leather of his vest creaking. He looked at the circle of his men, all still kneeling, their faces reflecting a mixture of shame and burgeoning rage. The Sterling Group thought they had hired the Iron Oaths to do their dirty work, to be the final hammer that broke the widow. They thought they were the ones holding the leash. As Kaelen looked at the dark windows of the SUVs lurking like vultures, a predatory smile touched his lips. The developers had made one fatal mistake. They had forgotten that while the Iron Oaths were outlaws, they were never without a master, and tonight their master was the woman they had been sent to destroy. The silence that followed Ilara's story was broken only by the rhythmic, metallic ticking of cooling motorcycle engines. Kaelen stood tall, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He didn't have to give a verbal order. The Iron Oaths moved as one, a silent choreography of leather and steel. They didn't retreat to their bikes. Instead, they fanned out, claiming the perimeter of the small, sagging porch like a living wall of thorns. The black SUVs at the end of the block finally began to creep forward. They moved slowly, predatory and confident, their headlights cutting through the rising evening mist like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. They didn't expect resistance. They expected the collection to be finished. They expected to find a broken old woman standing over a packed suitcase. The lead vehicle came to a halt just feet from the curb, its tires crunching over the gravel. 4 men stepped out. They were dressed in tactical black, their faces obscured by the shadows of expensive baseball caps, their hands resting habitually near the concealed holsters beneath their windbreakers. These weren't street brawlers. They were corporate cleaners, men who were paid to make sure progress happened without a paper trail. The leader of the group, a man with a jagged scar across his jaw and eyes that looked like cold glass, stepped toward the gate. He didn't even look at the motorcycles. "Vane," he called out, his voice sharp and entitled. "I assume the property is clear? We've got the demolition crew on standby for 6 a.m. You did your job, now get your circus out of our way." Kaelen didn't move from the top step of the porch. He stood directly behind Ilara, his heavy hands resting on the back of her chair, a silent promise of weight and shadow. "The job description changed," Kaelen said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that preceded a storm. The man with the scar paused, his foot hovering over the property line. He flicked a glance at the 20 bikers who were now standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces cold and unreadable. "Don't get sentimental, Iron Eye. We paid the club a premium to handle this quiet. Sterling doesn't like noise, and he certainly doesn't like being told no by a bunch of grease monkeys." "Then Sterling is going to have a very loud night," Kaelen replied. He reached into his vest and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill Ilara had offered him, flicking it into the dirt at the lead thug's feet. "The widow just hired a better class of protection, and unlike you, we don't work for the highest bidder. We work for the code." The thug looked down at the bill, then back at Kaelen, a sneer curling his lip. "You're making $1 million mistake over $5 and an old lady." "It's not about the money," Kaelen said, his eyes flashing with a lethal, predatory light. "It's about the dirt, and you're standing on the wrong side of it." The shadow of the SUVs retreated momentarily, their tail lights bleeding like fresh wounds into the gathering dark. But Kaelen knew they wouldn't stay gone for long. He turned to his men, and the air seemed to crackle with the sudden, sharp shift in his intent. He was no longer a debt collector. He was a general reclaiming a battlefield. "Close it down," Kaelen barked, his voice echoing off the worn siding of Ilara's house. "This block belongs to the Iron Oaths tonight. No one in, no one out, and if a blade of grass on this lawn is stepped on by someone not wearing a patch, I want to hear the sound of bone breaking." The transformation was clinical and terrifying. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was reimagined as a fortress of chrome and leather. The heavy cruisers were repositioned into a jagged, interlocking V-shape across both ends of the street, their headlights left on high beam to create a blinding white wall that obscured the house from any prying eyes or long-range lenses. The rhythmic thrum of the idling engines served as a low-frequency warning to the neighborhood, a heartbeat that said the predators were now the protectors. Jax and the younger riders were assigned to the gravel watch, patrolling the perimeter with a restless, aggressive energy that made the shadows seem to shrink away. They didn't need to brandish weapons. The sheer presence of 20 muscular men in heavy vests, their faces hardened by a sudden singular purpose, was enough to turn the street into a dead zone. The veterans, those who remembered the old code, took up positions on the porch and in the narrow alleyways between the houses. They moved with a practiced silence, melting into the darkness, eyes scanning for the glint of glass or the subtle movement of tactical gear. Kaelen himself remained on the top step, a silent sentinel. He watched as his men worked, feeling the heavy friction of the old photograph against his chest through the leather of his vest. He saw his lieutenants bringing out heavy industrial chains, looping them through the spokes of the bikes to create a literal barricade against any attempt to ram through. They weren't just protecting a person, they were shielding a legacy. As the mist rolled in from the nearby docks, thickening the air, the suburban street vanished, replaced by a sovereign territory where the only law was the word of Kaelen Vane. Ilara sat behind the door, the soft glow of a single lamp spilling onto the porch, a stark contrast to the harsh, industrial defense being built outside. The iron perimeter was set. The world outside the circle of motorcycles no longer existed. There was only the house, the widow, and the wall of steel that would die before it let either of them fall. The clock on Ilara's porch wall hadn't even finished striking midnight when the peace was shattered. The black SUVs didn't creep this time. They roared, 4 of them accelerating in a coordinated charge toward the Iron Oath's barricade. Behind them, a flatbed truck carrying a heavy steel ram led the way, its engine screaming in a desperate bid to clear the lot by dawn. But Kaelen "Iron Eye" Vane had spent 15 years studying the geometry of violence, and he had prepared a reception that no corporate budget could account for. "Light 'em up!" Kaelen's roar was lost in the sudden, deafening thunder of 20 engines hitting their rev limiters simultaneously. As the lead SUV hit the V-shaped barricade, it didn't find a soft target. It found the iron perimeter. The bikers hadn't just parked their cruisers, they had anchored them with heavy industrial chains to the sewer grates and power poles. The SUV's front end crumpled against the wall of steel, but the bikers didn't flinch. From the shadows of the alleyways, Jax and the younger riders emerged, not with guns, but with high-intensity flares that bathed the street in a hellish, flickering crimson glow. The thugs spilled out of their vehicles, reaching for their tactical gear, but they were blinded by the wall of high-beam headlights and the choking red smoke of the flares. The Iron Oaths didn't fight like soldiers, they fought like a pack. They moved through the chrome and fire with a terrifying, silent efficiency, using the heavy chains and their own momentum to disarm the suits before they could level a single weapon. In the center of the chaos, Kaelen met the man with the scarred jaw. The thug lunged, a telescopic baton swinging toward Kaelen's head, but Kaelen, the outlaw president, moved with the practiced grace of a man who lived in the eye of the storm. He caught the man's wrist, the leather of his glove creaking, and leaned in close enough for the developer's hireling to see the cold, dead reflection of the flames in his iron eye. "You told me I was making $1 million mistake," Kaelen growled, his fist connecting with the man's ribs in a blow that sounded like a dry branch snapping. "But you forgot to factor in the cost of a broken oath." He spun the man around, shoving him back toward the mangled SUV. All around them, the private security was being systematically dismantled, pinned against their own high-priced vehicles, by men who didn't care about a paycheck, only the woman sitting behind the wooden door. When the smoke finally began to clear, the developer's tactical team lay broken in the gravel, their expensive equipment scattered like trash. Kaelen stood in the middle of the street, his vest dusted with ash, as the flatbed truck put its engine in reverse and fled into the night. The fire of the flares died down, leaving only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the motorcycles, guarding the widow's silence.
The adrenaline of the midnight clash began to settle like the cooling ash from the flares, replaced by a heavy, reverent stillness. Kaelen climbed the porch steps, his boots thudding softly on the wood that his men had just fought to preserve. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed open the front door to find Alara sitting by the hearth, the vintage photograph still clutched in her lap. The small living room was a capsule of a different era, smelling of dried lavender and the faint metallic scent of the street that had followed him inside. Without a word, Kaelen reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest. He pulled out a thick, official-looking document bound in a blue legal folder. It was the original debt contract, the one that the Sterling Development Group had used to leverage his club against this house. He looked at the high-interest figures and the predatory clauses that had been designed to erase a woman's life for the sake of a high-rise. To the developers, it was $1 million asset. To Kaelen, it was a stain on the Iron Oath's name. He knelt before the fireplace, the light of the embers reflecting in his steady, iron-eye gaze. He didn't need a pen to sign it away. He simply leaned forward and fed the corner of the paper into the glowing orange coals. The flames licked the edge of the parchment, hungry and bright. Within seconds, the legal jargon that had been a death sentence for Alara's piece was curling into black soot. The names, the numbers, and the threats vanished into the chimney, turning into smoke that drifted over the very neighborhood Silas Vane had once sworn to protect. "The debt isn't just cleared, Alara," Kaelen said, his voice low and raspy as he watched the last of the folder turn to ash. "It never existed. My father paid for this house with the blood he spilled 40 years ago. We're just the ones who forgot how to count the cost." Alara reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the rough leather of his shoulder. For the first time that night, the lines of worry on her face seemed to soften. She didn't offer him the crumpled bills again. She didn't have to. The air in the room felt lighter, the suffocating weight of the Sterling Group's greed replaced by the ancient, unshakable heat of an outlaw's word. Kaelen stood up, the firelight casting a long shadow behind him that reached the door where his men stood guard. The contract was gone, reduced to nothing but a memory of a mistake he would never make again. As he looked at the empty hearth, he knew the Iron Oaths had finally balanced their books. The transaction wasn't recorded in a ledger, but it was written in the silence of a house that was finally, truly home. The morning sun rose over the east side, but it didn't find a neighborhood in ruins. It found a neighborhood that had been reborn. The black SUVs were gone,
and the private security teams had vanished back into the corporate shadows from which they crawled. As the light hit the suburban street, it glinted off the chrome of 20 motorcycles still parked in a protective semicircle around Ilara's home. The iron oaths didn't leave when the fight was over. They stayed to fix the fence, to paint the porch, and to ensure that every resident on the block knew the old code had returned. The reputation of the iron oaths shifted overnight. No longer were the patches on their backs seen as omens of debt and dread. Instead, they became the new sentinels of the suburbs. When the roar of their engines echoed through the streets now, mothers didn't pull their children inside. Shopkeepers didn't reach for their deadbolts. Instead, they looked up with a nod of silent respect, knowing that the most dangerous men in the city were now the only ones standing between them and the wolves in suits. Kaelen Iron Eye Vane had reclaimed his father's legacy, transforming a gang of outlaws back into a brotherhood of guardians. 6 months later, a familiar rumble vibrated through the air. Kaelen pulled his custom cruiser to the curb in front of Ilara's house, which now stood proud with a fresh coat of white paint and a sturdy new porch. He wasn't there to collect a debt or to lead a raid. He swung his leg off the bike, adjusted his leather vest, which felt lighter than it ever had before, and pulled a small wrapped box from his saddlebag. Ilara was waiting for him, sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, her white hair glowing in the afternoon light. She didn't kneel this time. She stood up with a warm, knowing smile and gestured toward the small table set with 2 delicate porcelain cups. "You're late, Kaelen," she teased gently, her voice no longer a whisper of desperation, but a melody of peace. Kaelen took a seat, his massive frame a stark contrast to the dainty chair, and set the gift on the table. Inside was a framed copy of the photograph that had changed everything, restored and preserved for the next 40 years. As he sipped the tea she had brewed, Kaelen looked out at the street where his men were parked at the corner, keeping a watchful, silent vigil. For the first time in 15 years, the Iron Eye wasn't looking for a threat. He was looking at a home. He realized then that while some men were remembered for the fear they sowed, a true leader was defined by the peace he protected. And as long as Ilara Vance had a kettle on the stove, the iron oaths would never lose their way again.